Hello everyone, my name is Rachel Moses and you are listening to the HP Leader podcast. And today this podcast is in celebration of Pansexual Pride Day, which is on the 8th of December 2020. So this podcast is going to be all you need to know about what pansexuality means and what it means to be a pansexual. So I am delighted to be joined by a wonderful host, and I'm actually going to start with Shay because she is directly beneath me in terms of the order of the panel, and Shay is joining us just on audio. So Shay, can you just introduce yourself?
Yeah, hi everyone. My name's Shay. I am based currently in the southeast of England, and I have been pansexual probably forever.
Thanks, Shay. Amy, over to you.
Hi, I'm Amy. I'm a team coordinator for a children's therapy service in East Sussex. I would probably have identified as pansexual for the last 5-ish years. But yeah, as Shay says, probably forever. In reality, yeah, looking forward to tonight. Thanks.
Thank you. And last but not least, Ella.
I'm Ella. I'm a physiotherapist and MSK physio based in the Northwest, and I identify as pansexual, and that's been a developing thing over the years, but yeah, I'd agree, probably my whole life.
So I'm going to kick off by a definition of pansexual, and I'm going to have to be really honest. When I joined the podcast tonight, not thinking I need to do any research for this podcast in particular, I realized I didn't have a definition. So a quick little Google search defines pansexual adjective as those not limited in sexual choice with regard to biological sex, gender or gender identity. So being pansexual means that you're attracted to people of all genders. This includes people who don't identify with any gender, so agender, and many pansexual people describe themselves as being attracted to people based on personality, not gender. So according to different classifications and organisations, the difference between being bisexual and pansexual is that being bisexual means you're attracted to one specific gender at that moment in time, but being pansexual is you can be attracted to more than one gender at the same time. So there's an overlap between gender-specific attraction. And I think one of the things I just want to get out there really early, and I don't want to speak on behalf of the panel, maybe just myself, is that for me, the term pansexuality or pansexual can automatically give connotations to the fact that it's about sex and it's about sexuality. And the term is much more than that. It's about attraction, it's about emotion, it's about romanticism, and we'll talk about what, pan-romantic as well, being within pansexuality. So I would think it's fair to say it's quite a new concept in terms of being under the LGBTQIA+ spectrum. There's no P there yet, it's in the plus bit. And certainly even in some of the EDI surveys, there's zero recognition of it as an actual sexual identity. So that's the kind of, that's the textbook Wikipedia Google search terminology. And I'm just going to come around to each of the panel to ask them again what being pansexual means to them. So Shay, can I start with you first, please?
Yeah, I think it's nice that you've touched on the bisexual stuff as well. So I identified as bisexual through my teenage years. I dated people who were male and female, but didn't really have much of an understanding of my feelings. So for me, the pansexuality came about as an identity because it just encompassed everything I felt about humans. I don't really see gender, I just see a person that I like or that I maybe wouldn't, socialize with outside of the situation I'm imminently in. So for me, things like age and gender and sex don't really come into it. And pansexuality is just an amazing term because it is so all encompassing. So for me, it's just about love and it's about humanity, and you know, I'm very lucky that I found my soulmate. He's incredible, and yeah, I just think everybody's got someone out there. It's just a matter of finding them. So,
and having fun along the way, and like you said, a little bit of love thrown in there as well.
yeah.
Thank you, Shay. Amy, coming to you, please.
I think it's a lovely definition actually. I think pansexuality for me was, as Shay said, at some point I defined as bisexual along the way, and we'll come on to that probably a bit later. But pansexuality was that difference between just liking guys, just liking girls. There was this kind of new development in the world, wasn't there? A good handful of years ago now, where gender identity blew up in the media, and we suddenly saw a lot more public figures that were going through their own transition. The term non-binary was being used much more, and non-binary people became much more exposed to everyone's information and what they knew about in the world. And for me, that's then correlated with my identity as pansexual. I think exposure to other people has a huge impact on how you identify, and suddenly now I'm aware that these kind of like all these different characters exist under so many different umbrellas and identities, and actually I felt attraction to all of them, not all of them, but I realized my attraction to people were not limited by their gender or sexual identity or gender identity, and actually that's when pansexuality really came into its own for me, when my exposure to people showed me that there was no limit to what I felt.
Yeah, and I think you've touched on a really great point there, because if people's journey into pansexuality is through bisexuality, you're almost under the umbrella. You're under the LGBTQI plus umbrella, so you almost don't need to like conform to some degree. But even if you were, in a club or something like that, and it's, if you say we're bisexual and you were either attracted to if it's the same sex, it would then almost be like a pressure on you to identify, are you gay, are you straight? And for me, it's the understanding of the concept in terms of it's fluid, and there's no need to compartmentalize, or it's okay to be part of the community under the umbrella and not necessarily be, rigid to the L, the G, the B, the T. So I think that's a really important concept, Amy, you've just touched on there. Thank you. And now, Ella, coming to you, because you might extend a little bit on this as well.
Yeah, I agree with everything that's been said so far, and I think, yeah, with Amy, definitely on the point of, probably always thought of bisexual, but then actually realising that gender is so much more complex and diverse, and that my attraction isn't based on gender, it's based on, that person basically, and that could be a wide spectrum of gender identities. And I think because of that sense of feeling restricted with my sexual expression, identity, putting myself in a bracket, I've always found really difficult. And I suppose we'll touch on this later maybe. But yeah, so going from like gay to straight to bisexual to gay to straight to pansexual, it's just always, if I was with a man, I was like, oh, well, I've lost part of me. If I was with a woman, I've lost another part of me. So I don't know, I always found it really difficult. And so I kind of warmed to the term queer. Technically, I'm definitely pansexual, and I'm, definitely proud to say I'm pansexual. But I just find queer enables me to maybe develop even more potentially. So with my gender expression, with my sexuality, I don't know, it just feels freer to me. So I don't have to, because I could develop even further. Do you know what I mean? It might take on a different, and I just felt I couldn't be open to sexual and gender expression because I was putting myself in a box all the time.
You know, that's a very powerful concept from a lived experience. It's all well and good being fluid under the umbrella, under the LGBTQI plus umbrella, but it's how you identify and how you feel in that moment in time. And this is where I haven't had many conversations with asexuals, but sometimes that is almost like it's the struggle that sometimes people come to before that identify with an asexuality. So for me, the term queer, again, even being within the community, it's a concept that I've never really fully understood. And I think because the original connotations with queer come like strange or not normal, but actually, like you've said, Ella, queer means something completely different for you. And again, to give a definition, a Wikipedia/Google definition, it's again an umbrella term for sexual and gender minorities who are not heterosexual and are not cisgender. You can identify as queer through any sexual identity or gender identity. It's just that you're not heterosexual and you're not cisgendered. So that really just leaves the door open, doesn't it, for you to identify how you feel within your own personal space. And I think that's something probably, and I was debating whether to do a separate podcast on this completely, but I think it'll like intersect through lots of different like sexual identities. So I think what I want to come back and ask you about then, Ella, is how do you, because you probably haven't really fully explored yourself, your sexuality completely, how do you then like describe it to people? How do you then, like, if someone was to ask you, what would you say? Or do you say anything? Because this is one of the things people really struggle with. If you're gay or you're straight, it's kind of easy. If you're bisexual, people kind of get that. But if you were to turn around and say, oh, I'm actually a pansexual, they're like, the pan what? The what? Is that even a thing? Like, what is it? So how would you start that conversation, Ella?
Sometimes I don't even put a label on it. Sometimes it's easy if I'm with somebody. So I'm with a woman, so I can talk about that. But I suppose the assumption is that I'm gay, and sometimes then it's correcting that and having that open discussion. So sometimes it might not even be that I say I'm pansexual or bisexual. It might just be, well, you know, I'm attracted to different genders. So sometimes it's not necessarily a word. Sometimes, to be honest, I do still say bisexual. And I think that's sometimes just for ease, because it's a term that people are aware of. It's a lot more common. And for me, even the term bisexual, even though it is a lot more rigid and strict, and that's why I don't personally identify with it, when I initially identified with it, I feel as though I did still identify with it in a way that was not binary to male and female. I did feel as though it was kind of, you know, more expressive than that. So I don't know, I'm variable. I'm variable of how I express it to other people, to be honest.
And I think for me, it's that my biggest thing is being defined. You personally are defined by the gender of the person that you're with. That's my biggest, if I could change one thing about people's perception, it would be that. It's define me as me, or allow me to identify as who I am, not because of the gender of the person I'm married to or with or whatever. And I think the way you've just explained it from what I've took on there is by saying you're pansexual if you're with a woman, that it's okay because you're pansexual, so you're being authentic to yourself, so you know that yes, you're with a woman, but actually you're equally okay with that if it was a man, or if it was someone non-binary, if it was a person that didn't want to identify as cisgender. So in your head, it's almost like a term or a concept where you can be in your authentic self, but you're not shutting another side of yourself away. Does that make sense? That's kind of how I relate to the term. And to be honest, I think we spoke about what in childhood, what terms you had back then is very different now. that's maybe what was lacking back then. So when you identify in later life, it's kind of like the penny drops, maybe.
I think there's something to
Amy.
say about a little bit, sorry, about not being able to identify as pansexual when talking to people, when people ask, because people don't yet understand it enough. As you said, bisexuality is more common and more known about. So if you are having that conversation, sometimes it's just easier to kind of skip over some of the explanation, or if you think it's going to be a difficult enough conversation, it is. Sometimes it's just easier to explain it that way, or sometimes it is easier to take out the label altogether and go for a description, because some people get a bit het up over, especially what they see as new labels coming in, that people are making stuff up all the time and everything's changing and how they can't keep up with it all. Sometimes taking out the label and just saying, you know, look, I'm attracted to people, and that's kind of it. It avoids that slightly awkward conversation, doesn't it, as well? So, I mean, you know, maybe in 10 years' time, if pansexuality is as known as bisexuality is now, you know, in conversation, I might be able to use that phrase a little bit more easily. And I try and use it now and describe what it is, but it's situational, isn't it?
Oh, absolutely. And I mean, you're damned if you do, if you're damned if you don't, because if you were to use a term that people don't know, they're like, bloody hell, here's something else, or is this just a phase, or is this just a fad, or is this the latest thing to come out? And you're like, oh no. So do you then invest your time and energy and breath explaining, or on the other side you say, oh well, actually I'm just attracted to people, and I don't have that concept where I have to define. And they're like, really, what does that mean? So it's like, there's inquisitiveness, but then there's the constant, I suppose everyone feels it's coming out, but also the constant explanation. But society does make work to define myself and pigeonhole myself, so it's kind of, I agree with you intrinsically, Amy, but the reality is people aren't satisfied unless you identify yourself and they say, but are you gay, are you straight, are you bi, like what are you? And it's like, oh goodness gracious, Ella.
Yeah, I mean, I completely agree with that, and I think that was a massive reason why I struggled with the whole, oh, now I'm straight, now I'm gay, now I'm this, now I'm that. It was actually pressure from other people, I felt, and maybe that was me internalizing that and thinking it was that, but I always felt like I had to say, oh, I'm this now, I'm this. Whereas if it wasn't presumed and it was just you are who you are, you'd just be. And I know that isn't the case and that isn't reality at all. And it's good to speak out and say who you are. But yeah, if you didn't have to constantly justify who you were to people, you could just be yourself. And I don't know, I think that would just be much less confusing. For me anyway, thinking about how I developed with my sexuality, it would be a lot less confusing if I didn't have the pressure from other people trying to put their labels on me.
Absolutely. I just had a little moment there where I was thinking, yeah, I can totally relate to that. Shay, I'm going to come down to you now, just with any of your thoughts on that. I know you mentioned at the beginning identifying as bisexual and then coming through that kind of process to where you are now, which is seemingly very content, very happy.
Yeah, I'm just really lucky. I completely agree with Amy in that I feel it's situational for me when I'm explaining something. So for me, I'm really lucky. I found my now husband when I was still in college. So we were, we've been together a very long time. We're happily married. I've got an amazing partner. And not everybody is lucky enough to find that in their life, and I completely understand that. But I do think it's situational. I work with a very wide demographic of people as colleagues and as my patients, and actually, with some patients, it's about opening up a dialogue about allowing them to express themselves, whether that be by their title on their patient records, or whether it be through colleagues asking me about things you got up to when you were younger, and actually saying, well, when I was going out with my girlfriend, this happened or that happened, and then that tends to sort of drop the penny and it opens a conversation. And for me, I think because I'm quite secure in where I am in myself, it makes me really lucky. And it's something that, Ella, I really hope that you find one day, because for me, I quite like imagery and analogies. So I ended up, I think one of the first times I spoke to one of my current colleagues, I ended up trying to explain it like football teams in a football league. So it was kind of like, if bisexuality is you can only like Chelsea or Arsenal, and then pansexuality is you can like any team in the English league. My disclaimer here is that I know nothing about football, but it was just a relatable way for him to understand kind of where I was coming from, because for him, my explanation of I just like people and I'm just attracted to personalities kind of just it wasn't a concept he understood. So I completely agree. It's situational depending on who you're speaking to when you're talking about that identity. But like I said, I think I'm just very, very lucky to be secure in where I am.
This absolutely boils down to the fact about society. So the analogy you've just used with football clubs, being a Geordie when Newcastle United, right? You had to grow up and you had to love Newcastle United. Like, it was non-optional. So if you were then to turn around and say, actually, I like Newcastle, I love Newcastle United, but I also love Man United, that's not acceptable in society. So for them to say, I love Newcastle United, Man United and Chelsea, it would be like, absolutely not. So I love that analogy, but in the same, there's consequences of that, isn't there? There's consequences of putting yourself out there and saying, okay, well, this is me, and society not understanding it and not accepting it. And I think this is maybe what goes on to the next point, which is some of the challenges or reactions you get when you do disclose your true authentic self, when you've realized or when you've come to an acceptance, I suppose, that you don't meet societal norm and that you are different, but you yourself are okay with that. So obviously everyone on the podcast can be in a different place with that at any time, and depending on life circumstances that may change, and the types of situations you're exposed to. But there is something about how people react to it as well. And I don't know if anyone wants to start with any reactions they've had. And obviously sometimes reactions can be really negative because they affect you personally and they remind you that you don't meet someone's expectations about what you look like. So on the lesbian podcast, for example, it was very much the first thing is you don't look like a lesbian, or you thought too pretty to be a lesbian, or you wear lipstick, or you wear high heels. It's like, so people are automatically visually stereotyping you against your sexuality or your sexual identity. So is it when people have kind of disclosed that they're pansexual or bisexual, whichever term we want to use, does anyone want to talk about some of the reactions that they've had and maybe how it's affected them? Ella?
I mean, I think there's loads of assumptions, isn't there? Loads of assumptions basically about pansexual people. And I think a big one for me would be, as a woman who identifies as pansexual, I think the assumption is that I will end up with a man. So I think sometimes, because I'm a woman, and maybe this is more connotations with being bisexual, and that assumption that you're experimenting or you're not quite sure. And I think for me, sometimes the assumption is that, oh, well, you'll end up with a man though. This is probably more when I was younger, probably not so much as being older, but then quite the opposite for my brother, who also identifies as bi or pansexual, who the assumption is that he will always end up with a woman. And I find that really interesting, that difference, it's that, oh, we're just experimenting with being gay and then you'll end up being straight, that kind of assumption. And then other things like, oh, well, it's fashionable now, that assumption, and I don't think that was even to being pansexual. It's just me and my girlfriend were at a party and, but it's fashionable to be gay now, so it's okay. And there's you could go on and on and on, couldn't you, about different assumptions. And I suppose they're just like mini microaggressions, aren't they, which makes you feel a bit like you are not the norm. I mean, it doesn't bother me too much, but I suppose over time I can see why it would definitely impact. And to be honest, it probably has impacted on me, really. But yeah.
I don't think you ever really understand the true impact until maybe you're in a stage of your life where you're completely settled and you're completely satisfied with who you are and you're accepted by the person that you're with as well. Maybe going back to what Shay was saying. So I do think there's something around that. And certainly people I speak to, either bisexual, pansexual, or who don't identify as any type of sexual identity, that's definitely something, until they're in that place in their life where they're truly their authentic self to their family, to their friends, to their partner, you never look back and you think, oh, actually that did really affect me. Now Shay, I know you wanted to come in there.
Yeah, I just to be honest with you, it's a bit of a question for Ella. I completely agree with you with the fact that it's, you know, it's seen as almost, oh, it's fashionable, it's a trend, you're attention seeking. And I do think that actually, from my experience, and this is only my experience, but I think that tended to be more of an attitude towards females than it did towards males. It was almost like males are, you know, quite dominant and allowed to be gay, and that's definitely a thing. But being a female, and maybe it was to do with the age that I was when I was identifying with that label, I don't know, but there was very much almost a hostility towards it, as if it, well, you're not real. And I wonder how that's affected you in your identifying with different labels, really.
Yeah, no, absolutely, I completely agree. I suppose it's been difficult for me because a lot of my long-term relationships have been with women. So, and my first long-term relationship was with a woman when I was 16. And so then so I was part of like the LGBTQ community and felt very much part of it. However, then when I came out of that relationship and then had relationships with men, I felt like I lost my identity a little bit. I felt like I wasn't really part of the community anymore. So I don't know, if anything, it's probably the opposite for me, because I felt not part of the LGBT community. It's taken me a long time to find people that, you know, apart from lots of different communities and all coming together. Whereas, I don't know, I think when you're younger, you're really searching for that sense of community, aren't you? So if when you start, you know, oh, I'm with a woman, you know, I still thought I was bisexual, but you just kind of go through that route and find that community, because at least you're with people there that do understand a bit more than maybe hanging around with, you know, heterosexual people. I don't know, it's a difficult one, really. I've been back and forth, up and down. But I definitely feel at this point, it may not come across like this, but I'm definitely much more comfortable in myself. But I mean, it is still definitely a journey, and it's something that I always feel I'm working on. I know who I am, but I think, yeah, I'm still going through a process, I think, realistically, of being really confident with that, I think, and yeah.
Amy.
Hi. Just something you said, Ella, kind of made me think, and the thing I've struggled with on and off over my course of kind of searching on who I am and what that looks like is the fact that who you're attracted to within the bracket of pansexuality, it does vary. Although we talk about pansexuality, so you can have attraction to absolutely anyone, it doesn't always mean that one week I am attracted to like everyone. So I'll go through months where I'll be particularly attracted to masculinity, and then I'll go through months where I'm particularly attracted to more femininity or like androgynous kind of people, and I think within, and I don't know if other people have this, or I don't know how people feel you don't really get to have these conversations with groups of people in this way, actually, which is quite nice. But because my own attraction changes so much, it can make you then feel a little bit turbulent within yourself. And I think that's where pansexuality came in even more for me, is in the same way that my gender identity, I identify as female, but my gender expression changes. I don't know if you've seen the Genderbread Man that there was before, and it's all about scales, isn't it? And how, you know, some days I might feel particularly feminine and want to dress in a really feminine way, and then other ways I really don't, and I'll dress in the most masculine outfit that I possibly own, just because my gender expression feels that way. I identify as female and I don't feel any other way, but my gender expression changes, and my sexual attraction to people changes, and my romantic attraction to people changes. And I think that turbulence can be unsettling for anyone. And I don't know if that's something around kind of how you're feeling.
Yeah, absolutely, Amy. I think you've just summed that up really, really, really well. Definitely, I think it is. It does change, doesn't it? And so then that's maybe why you are questioning it. And I think that's why, you know, going back to what I said before, sometimes always feeling like I have to put myself in a box. If I do that, I'll be changing boxes every day. So yeah, the term pansexual is just really nice. And then, yeah, and even further from that, I suppose that's why I'm identifying with the queer label. But what it means to you, I understand that queer can mean lots of different things for different people, as can pansexuality. But yeah, no, that sums it up perfectly, Amy. Thank you.
You see, and just to play devil's advocate there, I am almost like the complete opposite. I'm so consistent. I just fancy anything, anytime. Like, honestly, like, I think my kind of taste is just very consistent. So I don't identify with that at all, and especially with the gender identity, I totally accept that. And I'm sad that we couldn't get a couple of male, like, you know, cisgendered male pansexuals on here, just because of the fear of stereotypes. And actually the way they said that too is the way they explained it is that the LGBTQI+ world, which is so inclusive and so amazing to be part of, like a community, it can actually be quite judgmental as well. So when you don't identify yourself in a bracket, or if you're gay or you're a lesbian, it's kind of really easy for people within the LGBTQI+ umbrella to identify with you, or you're the T or you're the I. So actually being part of the P, which doesn't really fully exist. So that was a real eye-opener for me, again, with the gender differences between this. And going back to Shay's point, I think, which was around, you know, it might be easier for women, for it to be sexy for women to be bisexual or gay. You know, when around the time when I remember, like when I was 14, 15, 16, it was the term was coined lipstick lesbians. So they were just like women who would snog each other when they were drunk, or like do it for male attention. And I just remember that sticking. And people, when you were trying to like explore your own identity, it would be like, because of the way you looked, it would be like, oh, you're lipstick lesbian, or like Ella, I think you said, oh, you're just confused, or you're just greedy, or you know, you don't know what you want. And there was real, around that time, there was real like effects of it being trendy and being like acceptable. And, you know, from an older person's perspective, whether it be friend, like family members, it would be just a phase, or you're just going through a phase and you'll outgrow it. And it's like, well, you know, from a completely heteronormative straight person, have you ever had those thoughts about the opposite gender? Like, and if you haven't, that will be, you know, as much as it being, you're thinking it might be a phase, it definitely won't be, because if you're never attracted to the opposite sex, you know, you probably won't be. You're heteronormative, and those that are not heteronormative. And I think that's, again, a whole other spectrum, isn't it, that people just don't understand. Shay, I don't know if you wanted to come in there, or you were just giving Ella a thumbs up before.
I was just cheering you all on, because honestly, the way you put that is literally like, I wish I was that eloquent. I really do. I completely agree with what you were saying there. I think it's, yeah, on point.
Amy, coming back to you.
I think we might have a lot in common, Shay, because I met my other half as well when we were in university, so very, very similar there, and we are now happily married. But I met him before his transition, so my other half's a trans man, and my husband. Other half partner is my default. It's what I say, but my husband, I suppose. He's a trans man, and yeah, we met a good few years, about 4 or 5 years before about 2-3 years before he started his transition, and about 4 years into our relationship when he told everyone, and started down a path of like further transition. So we've gone through that kind of journey together, and it's funny because sexuality wise, when I went to an all-girls school when I was in secondary, and so my exposure was with other females, and I realized I had feelings for other females, so I must have been a lesbian, so I identified as lesbian. And then I went to uni, and in the physiotherapy world, you are half naked half the time, and I realized, oh, hold on, all these people that aren't females I had attraction to as well. So I was like, oh, I like guys as well. Okay, fine. I met my other half at this time, so I was in a same-sex relationship, but I started identifying as bisexual. And then my other half transitioned, and a couple of years later we went to Trans Pride in Brighton, and there was a whole host of characters, and I remember very specifically standing in the queue for some food at a fast food truck. It was a group of 3 people, but all identifying as a non-binary, but one of them in particular just knocked my socks off, and I was just standing in this food queue thinking, if I was single and if I had probably a couple of pints down me, I would definitely go and say hello. And I think it was at that point for me that I was like the cherry on top, that I realized that pansexuality was completely the label that fitted how I felt. And I just think, yeah, it's going back to that exposure to who you're around and who you know, because for me, throughout my life, it has just depended on who I am exposed to, about whether I like them or not. There's probably a better way to end that, but you know what I mean.
Definitely. Ella, do you want to come in there?
Yeah, I mean, that's really interesting, and I completely agree, because I think when you hear some LGBTQ plus stories, sometimes you can hear, I've known since I was, born, kind of thing. And, when I was at high school, like, to be honest, I didn't even know if I was attracted to men. I just didn't really have an attraction. I was attracted, but not probably in a sexual way to anybody. And you have your crushes, but it was never, I don't think it was sexual, basically. And it was only when I met a woman that then I became sexually attracted, and then it just kind of happened, and then it developed. So it's never something I never really thought about as such. It was just when I met somebody and it happened, and then I met somebody else and that happened, and it was just kind of a developing thing depending on who I met, rather than a thought process necessarily. But certainly not when I was a teenager, which is, yeah, I don't think I probably did, but my recollection is that I didn't really start thinking about it until I met people and just fell in love, and
Oh, Ella, it's because there's so much pressure on you to have your first snog, to have your first shag, to have, there's like the first base, the second base, the third base. It's like there's so much pressure on children. That's what they are, because it starts way before you're 16, and it goes back to that societal reinforcement again, doesn't it? It's much different now for the kids that are grown up, but only just now, so we're probably not going to reap the benefits in our generation. But that's why, because there's that pressure. That's what it is. It's okay. And you're classed as frigid, you're classed as, you know, you get labelled because of it, because you're just not ready to explore your own sexual identity because you don't know what it is. But yeah, and why should you be tarnished or stigmatized?
I think and you do. I think you do things though, you know. So even though I don't think I was attracted to anybody, I think you do just get caught up with what you think you should do, and you get caught up in it all, don't you? But realistically, I don't think I really,
And do you know, I'm laughing because for the majority of pan and bisexuals who just end up going down that route, your first relationship 9 times out of 10 is with a woman, because of the horrendous experience that you might have with a boy. Shay, can I come down to you?
Yeah, I kind of wanted to say, Ella, I absolutely agree. My absolute honest opinion is that the only reason that my marriage is as amazing as it is because we were friends first. And we were friends in college. We were in a friendship group. There was quite a lot of us in the group. And to be honest, initially we were just kind of mates, and then it was one of those like, oh, do we make it a relationship? Do we not make it a relationship? And I'd only just broken up with my girlfriend, and it was all very messy because we were at college, and there was a particular kind of group of people who were quite hyper religious, and so we'd been very controversial by holding hands in public places and things like that. So actually there was this whole kind of tornado that I'd come out of, and it was almost like I was spinning on the spot, just, you know, the tornadoes left me there. And I was really lucky that my husband was just a really good friend. And for me initially, whereas my relationships with my girlfriends in my teenage years were very much about exploring my sexuality and trying to work out, is this female thing a thing? With him, it was just like, you're my best friend, you're my confidant, you're the person that I'm safe around. And that's kind of how it grew instead. So it's just strange for me that for my female relationships, it was very much more sexually driven. But for my male relationship with my now husband, it was just about marrying your best friend.
And do you think some of that, Shay, is because consciously or subconsciously it was because you fitted more of a norm, you fitted more of a society norm, so it was easier, it was more accepting, it fitted with the profile? Like,
I can see it from that side of things, but equally no, because so I ended up, it was my birthday very closely after we'd formally started going out, and my mum invited him to a family dinner for my birthday. And he, at the time, I mean, we're talking sort of, 90s 2000s here, so like he had hair that was down to the bottom of his back, and we were in like Slipknot hoodies and all sorts of stuff. So he was the epitome of what my mum did not want me to bring home. And a lot of people say, oh, it was you rebelling, but actually it wasn't. I just really loved him. But he although he was male, and I think my mum accepted that better because she'd always denied my female relationships were relationships and just said they were friendships. With my parents, he definitely was like not necessarily what they wanted, but he became the son-in-law that they definitely love now, so it's worked out okay in the end.
Thank you. Now, moving tack slightly, and just thank you, Amy, for sharing. That's almost like a podcast in itself, your life story, I have to say. So watch this space for that. What I want to touch on before the final part is about what makes a good ally, what makes a good support, is, have you ever felt judged or vulnerable when you've kind of declared your sexual identity? And I know we've kind of touched on this, but one of the things I think is commonly misunderstood, and again, if I relate it to the LGBTQI+ umbrella and the heteronormative umbrella, is that people just can't understand the physical sexuality side of it. So as much as we've all talked about how it's been attracted to people, a person, a human with behaviors you find attractive, with emotions you find attractive, and sometimes visually you find attractive, but not always. It's what the strongest attraction is at that moment in time, and that can be physical, it can be mental, it can be emotional, it can be whatever just floats your boat, if you like. But what a lot of people can't understand is the actual act, the sexual act. And they're like, well, how come you can find like sex with a man as good as sex with a woman? It's like, isn't it totally completely different? And I think you don't necessarily think about it on that level. And for me, one of the things, if we talk about judgment or vulnerability, it's like getting into that concept. I don't know if anyone can relate to that, or has been in a situation where they've been judged like because on that level. And I think people listening to this podcast might be thinking, oh God, yeah, I've always either wanted to ask that question or not understood it. Amy, coming to you.
I definitely feel that the people that, and you touched on it earlier, the LGBTQI plus community can be fantastic and can be really welcoming, and sometimes can be massively judgmental. And the judgmental side I've found is that when you talk about your life, or if you are being quite open with people and you're talking about pansexuality and touching on some of the sexual elements of it, I think because I have never been with a cisgendered male physically, I get judged a little bit from my peers as well, how do you know that you like men in that way? How what if actually you had that kind of relationship, and then just, you know, how do you know until you try, basically? And I think it's a thing that comes up with bisexuality, with pansexuality, and I think Ella touched on it earlier when you were saying that actually, or Rachel, I can't remember, one of you said about how when you're growing up as a heterosexual person or a homosexual person, how is it that you know that you're not going to like, you know, there's lots of guys that have only had sex with other guys, or girls that have only had sex with other girls. How do you know you're not going to enjoy sex with that other person? Well, you don't, but that's not part of it, is it? You know, sexual attraction, romantic attraction, you can feel that without needing to act on it first. And I think that's how I feel about it.
Definitely, that's so powerful. Like, I have so many female friends, lesbians, who self-identify as lesbians, and they've just never been with a man, never will be with a man, and can't think of literally anything worse. You know, one of my friends is like repulsed even just thinking about it, and it's kind of like I've never had those strong like feelings either side, but I totally respect it. And you know, that's just how she always describes it and comes across as it, because she has no sexual attraction, zero, to the opposite sex, and she compartmentalizes all of that because that's how she feels. And I suppose I like say I'm the complete polar opposite of that, because I just have this whole spectrum and I'm consistent. So, and then like Ella and Amy, you've come in and say actually you do have that in different parts, and it's quite fluid in how you can move between them. Ella, do you want to come in on any of those points before I come down to Shay?
Yeah, I suppose following on from your point there, you know, it's interesting, isn't it? So, you know, when I was identifying as gay, it was very much with other gay women, oh, gold star lesbian, you're a gold star lesbian. It was very much seen like, you know, I've not had sex with a man, that means I'm the best type of lesbian. So it's all this pressure of either being really gay or like really, it's really difficult, I think, even within the LGBT community. Probably not now, it's something I don't experience now, I'm talking about 10 years ago. It felt very like rigid within that community as well as within like a heteronormative community. So pressure from both sides really sometimes, I think. from feeling, what was the original question?
I don't think there was a question really. It was me feeling vulnerable or judged because you've identified as pansexual. Like, have you ever been in that situation? So yeah, I think that was the question.
Yeah, and I suppose, yeah, maybe. I suppose for me, I think where all my feelings of judgment and shame maybe come from is when I am openly with a woman. So I think, you know, even though I am open in every aspect, it's taken me a long time to get to that point. And I think, like I said, I was very open when I was young. At university, I identified as a lesbian, very open in every setting. However, then when I came into the work setting, that really changed for me. I split up with my girlfriend at the time. I was then dating men and women, and I didn't feel like I could really be open about, I suppose, the gay side of me, you know, the side where I wasn't a hetero person. And so that really made me, that really affected my relationships when I was with women massively. And so there's a lot of shame with that as well. So I think for me, I wouldn't say I've had too many, definitely my progressions with regards to being pansexual, but I think where all my feelings of maybe difficulty and judgment and worry has definitely been when I've been in an openly gay presenting relationship. Yeah,
and I think certainly doing research from the podcast for lived experience, people who couldn't feel like they could speak on this podcast, the discrimination that exists for people who identify as non-heteronormative is huge. And I think, I don't want to say it's especially worse for bisexual and pansexual people, but certainly that there's an underrepresentation, I think, and an under-recognition, particularly within healthcare, particularly within AHPs. I think this is what the Gay Man podcast, honestly, like, I'm beating them off with a stick. I've got lesbian ladies sliding into me DMs like every day to be on the podcast, which is brilliant. But then for this podcast, bisexual podcast, it's trans podcast, it's like, it's really trying to hunt out people. And then when you do, it's just finding there's just not that psychological safety to talk about it. Why? Because of the fear of repercussions, because of the fear of discrimination. If people say, oh, I'm an inclusive manager, or I don't care what your sexual identity is, that's not enough. It's about making sure people can be their authentic self at work. So that's if they have a girlfriend one week and then they have a boyfriend the next month, that's okay and people aren't judged. We're so far off that, and we'll move on to kind of how can you be more supportive of it in a minute. But I really want to get that mental health side across, and how the reason why people might not identify as bi or pansexual is because of that just fear of not fitting that non-heteronormative gay, straight, gay man, lesbian woman, about being on that fluidity spectrum, especially for younger or newly qualified people. That's not being ageist, that's just because they haven't got the life experience and the opportunities. Because people generally, when they're not sure about their sexual identity when they're in the teenage years, explore much less, or they'll try and compartmentalize themselves, a bit like what you were saying, Ella, into being a lesbian or into being straight, when actually those years are when everyone else is exploring their sexuality, some more than others. But actually you feel oppressed because society makes you force yourself into that pigeonhole. And I think for me, my wish for the next generation is that people are just free to explore their own self, because not everyone's going to be like pansexual, bisexual, gay. But people have the right for that freedom of choice and exploration, and it not being judged for it, because the repercussions of that are significant. So Shay, I'm coming down to you for any comments before we move on to the last question. I don't know if you've got anything to add.
Yeah, I just think on the vulnerability side of things, really, rather than being a sort of vulnerability from society, actually, I really struggled when I settled you know, I'd always kind of been very much, I know I'm not straight and I know I'm not gay. I know I'm somewhere in the middle or on a spectrum. But when I got into a really committed relationship, I then really struggled with myself because I missed female company. I missed female attention and female affection because I was in a long-term relationship with a man. And so it became quite rocky for a little while, and I'm lucky that I was very well supported through that by my partner. Actually, the vulnerability was my own, and it manifested in ways that I'd never recognized before because I'd never seen them. So it's just, I guess, my wishes for sort of the future, really. It's just that people know that they can be open.
Oh yeah, I think we're losing you a bit, Che, with the audio. But yeah, I think I definitely think you're right there. And sometimes it's, if I turn that on the head a little bit, sometime if with like heteronormative men or women who get with a pansexual, bisexual, I think sometimes if you don't disclose it at the very beginning, there might be a sense of, I would never have got into this if I knew. I'd never have went down this path.
Absolutely, yeah.
And I think that's another thing that is important to point out about those who are in that sexual fluid space, romantic fluid space as well. Like I said, I need to be very clear, this isn't just about sex. There's almost a feel to pigeonhole yourself for the other person you're gonna get with. And it's the same with if you're female relationship, the female can be, you know, that if they're a sort, like you said, gold star lesbian, Ella, and they're getting with someone who actually isn't, there's then the challenges that might exist there.
Yeah.
And it's very different for the bisexual, pansexual group, I think, that the gay and the lesbian group don't have.
Yeah, I think it's just an interesting twist. You know, it's very easy, I think, for people to say, oh, society versus the community, because that's something that's been so massively focused on for a very, very long time. But actually the mental health of the people who live within that community is really important. And, you know, I think people need to know that there's always someone they can reach out to.
Thank you. So this is the final concluding point, and it's nearly an hour we've been chatting. It always flies by. So this is the advice section. So this can be advice to your younger self. This can be advice to managers, to colleagues, to peers, to lecturers, educators. How can you be a good ally or a supportive ally to someone who is either identified as pansexual or maybe comes to you and says, look, I'm struggling to sexually identify myself, but I'm attracted to multiple genders here. Kind of, what would your advice be? Now, Amy, I'm going to come to you first for that.
I think mine would probably be in two parts. One, I'd say, is make the most of your diverse population in your workforce already, especially if you've got workforce that identify as LGBTQI+ already. Make sure that they're comfortable and confident in the workplace, and try and see if they're giving out the right messages, because actually, I mean, what I've found along the way is as soon as you go into a new workplace, if there are people there that identify within that umbrella or kind of in any diversity field to an extent, and they are openly celebrated and encouraged and feel confident in that workplace, you know that's somewhere safe. And so that kind of starts at us, at our level as well, to make sure that we're doing that for new people coming in, but also I think sits at a manager level to make sure that the equality and diversity is really celebrated further down, especially if that manager is heteronormative, white, middle class, you know, and they're not showing any diversity characteristics themselves. Actually, you know, make the most of your workforce, and celebrate that at that level, and that will really encourage people to feel comfortable and confident in who they are. I think I think the other side of it is just give people time. I think you touched on it earlier, but I think some people can display characteristics that will kind of try and illuminate either their sexuality or some of their gender identity. And I think some people do that in order to try and start those conversations, and giving people time and space to try and express to you about their life, maybe giving some nice open questions and giving them the time and space to see what comes of it. Spreading positive equality and diversity messages is only going to then allow that gate to be open to people talking about their life. I think if you start showing, you know, if those little microaggressions or negative comments anywhere in the service, that's gonna shut that gate, and no one's gonna express how they feel.
So you've 4 really great points there. So the power of networks. I'm in an organisation where it didn't have an LGBTQI+ network until like this year. I didn't start it. Chief pharmacist Keith did. But how bad is that, eh? A London hospital. So I completely agree with you. Power of the networks, become part of your networks. You can be a silent member. You can just be there. You can listen. You can lurk. But they're there when you need it, and it's that part of the community. Role models, I completely agree with that. And within my organisation, part of the network, we are hearing, co-chair it now with Keith, and we are hearing some really horrific stories that our colleagues have suffered in our workplace, but also some absolutely amazing stories where we have, you know, a bisexual female who has never felt so included because her line manager is a gay man. So she's just being able to relate to that and see he's in a place where she can be is really powerful. Inclusive language. So I think the term "have you got a partner" is so overused, and it's actually used very flippantly now as if it is inclusive language, but it's very a yes and no closed question as well. So sometimes now if I'm trying to read a situation, I'll be like, are you with anyone? And then the person can come back and say, I'm with a girl, I've got a girlfriend, or I've got a boyfriend, or I have a partner. And by allowing them to say I have a girlfriend rather than yes, I've got a partner and it's a woman, it's kind of like I feel like we need to understand what is inclusive language a bit more for pansexuality, bisexuality, for non-binary. I don't think we're there yet, and I think within the community, I don't think we know ourselves, and I think non-binary people are excellent at this, and I cannot wait for the non-binary podcast because I think we've all got so much to learn from people who understand their own gender identity or lack of it really well. And then the last thing was calling out microaggressions, but actually understanding what they are. So there's overt microaggressions, there's unconscious microaggressions, there's societal, there's institutional, there's circumstantial, you know, and it's almost like with I've got a friend who everyone thinks he's gay because he's so camp, and he's not. He's the most complete heteronormative, and they're like, oh, he'll come out eventually, he's in the closet, and it's like, no, he really loves his wife and they're very sexually active, actually. I know that because he's, you know, they talk about it quite openly. And it's almost kind of like but he says himself, like he says, I'm campus Christmas and I love it and I'm never going to stop being me and I'm completely confident. So it's but they're microaggressions. That's even though this person, my friend, he doesn't identify as gay, he's still almost marginalized because of the person that he's not, because everyone thinks he needs to be. So Amy, thank you for sharing those. Ella, would you like to add on to any of those or reinforce any of those?
Yeah, I think all great points. I definitely agree on the assumptions. I think it's really, to be a good ally, it's really taking away those assumptions, really. So assumption about gender, assumption about sexuality. Recently we did within our service some training around talk about sex with patients, because obviously it's a big part of MSK. You know, sex might be a functional goal, or it might be that we're asking around, you know, Cauda-Equina syndrome, and how to ask those questions sensitively. And that's where we looked at the gingerbread man that you mentioned, Amy, and it's really good. And I think within my team, of what I'm aware of, everyone apart from myself identifies as cisgendered straight, and it's a really nice open conversation and lots of questions, and really talking about try not to make assumptions when you're speaking to patients. Don't assume that they identify as a man or a woman, or, you know, and don't assume that they are straight, or depending on how they present visually. And that was really positive. Whereas take it 5 years ago, and, you know, a large reason as to why I really struggled coming out in just purely in the workplace, was due to a lot of homophobia and transphobia and things being said and nobody speaking up. And I think when people don't speak up, it gives the sense that it's not just that one person saying it that agrees, it's everybody agrees with that. And I think to be a good ally is, if you feel comfortable to, and not everybody does, if you can speak up, you know, say something, I think would really make a big difference to be able to people feeling comfortable to be able to be who they are, really.
I love that. And when we were having the bit pre-chat, I told a story, didn't I, about the professor that stood up and went against the grain. And that was so powerful for me, because he took the time to have conversations with me and understand me as a friend, but as a really clever person with a position of like power and influence. For him then to stand up and say, actually, no, this isn't acceptable, and without completely outing the situation, I don't think people should ever underestimate the power of that and how that will make that person feel. And also the flip side of that, Ella, is if they don't do that. So if they know and they just let it pass by, or they think, oh, well, I didn't want to make the situation awkward, or I didn't want to single you out. It's like, well, there's ways you can get around that. You don't need to make it about me or about a person. You can make it about generally, because that's my belief. My belief is that homophobic language you're using is unacceptable, and it doesn't need to be because I have a gay friend or a bisexual friend or a pansexual friend that I'm not standing against it. So Ella, I think that's a really important point. And also for the people listening, it's to really understand, to speak to people, you know, and if you have no gay friends or bisexual friends or pansexual friends, like in the workplace, ask to be involved in the network. Say, is there someone that would sit down with me and have a coffee and explain some of the lived experiences and how I can be a good ally? I think generally when you're part of a minority group or a community, if you know generally people are interested, you don't mind having the conversation a million times. But there has to be authentic meaning behind it, because if there's not, it is just so draining. And we've heard that time and time again from all the podcasts that we've been doing. But when there's an authentic change behind it, and if it's just one person, then that's so meaningful for the individual. Now, last but not least, Shay, coming down to you for your final comments, add-ons, anything else?
Yeah, to be honest with you, I just think everything that's been said is so on point, and I'm just so privileged to be a part of this evening, and I just thank you all for allowing me to be in this space, really. My only kind of point would just be that, you know, we're all from different walks of life, we're all from, you know, slightly different backgrounds, and we're all in this together. And so if if you're not quite sure, or you want to clarify something, then like you say, do it with sincerity, because for me, I don't want you to instantly just get it. I don't want you to instantly understand it and have a complete understanding of my mental framework, but I just want you to have enough of a kind of acceptance to take on board and listen to what I'm saying, and then just to pay that nice, just pay that forward and allow other people that time and space as well.
Yeah, I really like that addition, and I'm so glad you joined us, Shay, because I hope you don't mind us declaring this, but when you first sent us your little memo or or draft when you weren't going to join in person, it like literally moved us to tears, your experience. And I was sat in this office at stupid o'clock at night, and I was like, oh my God. And then, so I'm so chuffed and I'm so grateful that you joined the panel, because I think what this podcast particularly has shown me is that even people who identify the same, there's so much difference, and that's to be embraced and supportive and loved. And I really hope that anyone who's struggling can reach out to anyone on this panel. I know everyone's happy to be contacted, and we'll put social media handles underneath it, and just say, you know, you are accepted. This is real. This is real life, and it's okay. And things will get better. And for some, things are really great. And for all of us, we're in a great place, but we're all still learning. And like you said, Amy, you know, this conversation would not have been happening, I would even say, like 2 years ago. I mean, this is just such a new like concept, and I think it's that penny dropping when you understand the concept. And Ella, I would love to come back and have a conversation with you like in a year's time to see where you're at. Definitely with regards to the queer umbrella and spectrum, because I'm learning about that all of the time. So I never like having the last word, and I'm just going to go around to each and every person. If you've got a final comment, you might not, final opinion or anything else you'd like to say. Ella, over to you.
I've not got anything else to add, but just thank you very much. It's been really, really good and helped me in ways that I didn't think it would actually. It's been really helpful.
Thank you. Amy?
One thing I will say is I just want the NHS to have pansexual or some way of self-identifying on their list of demographics, please. It's something I talk about quite frequently. I was going to talk about in this podcast, but then I completely forgot. So yeah, thought I'd just add it in the end. Come on, get it on the list of demographics.
I love the fact you brought it in, and that even for the physios listening to this on the EDI survey, I think it's just completely been missed out as well. But the P is part of the plus, isn't it? So it might be LGBTQIA plus, P plus in the future, who knows?
I'm happy being a plus, just as long as I can self-identify.
Oh yes, an open option, definitely. Shay, final comments?
Bit profound being the last one. For me, really, it's just about loving everyone. Like, just be nice and love people. And if you're struggling, reach out, because someone else will be nice and they will share the love. And whether that be as a friend, as a colleague, as a partner, whatever it is, just know that it's out there and the right person will come eventually. So keep going.
Absolutely. And on that note, I want to say thank you very much. Thanks for being on the podcast. You're all amazing, and take care.